He got his PhD from University of California, Berkeley, where he specialized in Leviticus 16, chapter on the Day of Atonement. He's been conducting a series here over the last week called The Gospel According to Moses, where we have talked about the sanctuary and access to God, what to do with guilt, Yom Kippur and the character of God, and just this morning we covered divine standards versus human subjectivity. I'd like to welcome Dr. Roy Gane to talk about what God wants from you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're on, right? Okay? Oh, wow, now we're really on. Okay.
But now you're off again.
Now I'm off again?
Now you're on again.
I'm off. Oh, okay. On again, off again. I didn't really totally finish the presentation this morning, and so we're going to lay a little bit more groundwork before getting to the final presentation. Just quickly finish up, and I think you'll find this interesting and helpful. We're going to move fairly rapidly, but we want to leave some time at the end for questions you have about any aspect of biblical law, including regarding the sanctuary, because that's an area of biblical law. You know, God gave instructions for all of that. So any questions, things that you've read about laws that seem strange, you know, mixed garments maybe, or divorce, or homosexual practice, or anything that's bothering you or has bothered you. Feel free to raise that. I can't promise that I'll have all the answers. If I don't have an answer, I'll freely admit it. I'll give you a very dogmatic, I don't know. So, without further ado, let's have a prayer, and then, shall we? Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this wonderful, beautiful day with the sunshine, and I thank you for the great 6.5-mile hike that I just enjoyed. It was just fabulous. So we thank you for your word, for your gifts, and for each other, that we can support each other and enjoy this wonderful occasion, this day. Be with us now as we explore more into your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so covenant framework. Law functions within a covenant framework. That's very important for us of law and what it's all about. For example, we see in Leviticus 6, Deuteronomy 28, it's very clear law is functioning within a legal framework, which are covenant blessings and curses for those who either obey God's law or don't. Now, obedience, what's the issue with obedience? It's about loyalty. Loyalty is what God requires. His people are faulty in various ways, but they must be loyal. Okay. Compare ancient Near Eastern treaties. I mentioned that this past week, that in ancient Near Eastern treaties that have been found in Hittite texts of the 2nd millennium BC, that is before 1000, and in 1st millennium BC texts, that's fine. I'll turn this one off. Thank you. That one's off. Thank you very much. Is this better? Okay. Yeah. You know what? There was an African proverb that Theodore Roosevelt liked. It went, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." So I'll speak loudly and carry a small stick. All right. Couldn't resist that. Ancient Near Eastern treaties. If one country is going to make an agreement with another, particularly if you have a higher king and a lesser king, then there were various parts to the treaty. It's like, you know, when you want to sell a house, you go along to a store and you buy a special form that you have to fill out, receipt for deposit. I was trying to survive in graduate school, so I actually got my California real estate license. Didn't make a lot of money, but I learned quite a bit. And I learned that you had to have certain bases that had to be covered for that to happen. Okay, so this is like that. It's like a format that God used in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, which was similar to what was used in ancient Near Eastern Hittite treaties especially, in which there was a historical prologue that reviewed the relationship in the past, what the greater king had done for the lesser king, why the lesser king should be grateful, right? And then stipulations as a result, what the greater power expected from that lesser power. And by expected, I mean demanded, okay? For example, if somebody attacks me, then you have to come help me. If I need to attack someone on the other side of you, then you need to provide safe passage and facilitate things. You shouldn't be harboring enemies or collaborating with enemies against me. You know, that kind of stuff, right? Okay, so stipulations. Of course, in God's law, in God's treaties with Israel, God made a treaty with Israel. He was the great king, right? Made a treaty with Israel, which he gave the covenant because he was the superior power. And he also reviewed, like in the book of Deuteronomy, you have a number of chapters, first 11 chapters of Deuteronomy are reviewing what God has done for his people in letting them go. And then you start these stipulations, the laws. And then there are other elements that show up there, which are blessings and curses, witnesses, and instead of calling upon all the other gods like they did in ancient treaties, Moses called upon heaven and earth. I call upon heaven and earth to witness against you this day. There was also the provision that the law, the treaty document, which spelled out the terms of the covenant, had to be stored in the temple. Okay? So, of course, the Ten Commandments stored in the sanctuary fulfills that function. And furthermore, there was provision in these Hittite treaties for the stipulations and the treaty to be regularly read to the leaders and so on. And what do we find in Deuteronomy? It has to be read to the people periodically. Okay, so you can see God was using a very persuasive kind of approach that people came up with, and this way people would understand this is a binding contract, we have obligations and responsibilities. Law contributes to the purpose of the covenant to reveal and express God's character. Compare the prologue to Hammurabi's law code. Laws exemplify the king's justice. Now this law code is in, I believe, the Louvre Museum, if I'm not mistaken. Is it in the Louvre or the British Museum? There's something else in the British Museum which I've seen. The Rosetta Stone, okay. But this one I think is in the Louvre in Paris. And so this is on a piece of stone, and it's chiseled in. And at the top there's a picture of the sun god, Shamash. He's the god of justice. Because the sun can see everything going on, right? He's got a big perspective related to what we talked about today. You have to know a lot to be really safeguarding justice. And Shamash is giving the law to Hammurabi. Now, there's a prologue before the laws of Hammurabi, which very interesting. And if you want to take my Akkadian class, which is Babylonian language and Assyrian language, we read those laws in that class, in the original language, from the original signs. Why do we teach Babylonian at our seminary? Well, look, Revelation 18, verse 4 says that we're supposed to call people out of Babylon. How can we call them out of Babylon if we don't know the language? Right? Okay, in any case, Hammurabi's law code, there are a lot of parallels to biblical laws. But the purpose, it's very clear from the prologue, which is like an introduction, is to proclaim the justice of the king, to make the king look good. Okay? So that he is going to regulate society in a way that is in harmony with the will of the gods, right? And that makes him look good. Now, of course, in the Bible, it also tells a lot about the character of the one who gives the law. Don't laws reflect the moral tone of whoever's giving the law, right? You know, there were laws in the 1930s, for example, and 40s over in Germany, which were really very devastating laws, and they said a lot about the society. So if you have just laws versus, in America, a number of years ago, we had laws of apartheid, which were unjust laws, see? So God is proclaiming his justice the way Hammurabi did. God inaugurated covenants and gave laws to people whom he had already delivered. Now, what do politicians do? The politician makes promises, and then the politician is inaugurated, as we remember quite recently. And then we find out if the politician is going to deliver on the promise, right? That's not the way God worked. God inaugurated covenants and gave laws to people whom he had already delivered. So what happens is, okay, Noah was already saved from the flood. God promised to save Noah from the flood. Then God delivered on his promise. And then God sets up the covenant. Okay, if you want to go on keeping this covenant, now that you're being delivered from the flood and you're alive rather than drowned, if you want to have this ongoing relationship with me, we can set that up now. So we have the inauguration of that relationship. There's God's order is promise, delivering on the promise, and then inauguration. Now, we talked this week about faith, didn't we? Faith in Christianity. Many Christians have the idea of faith as being a blind leap out into nothingness. That is not the biblical view of faith. The biblical view of faith is from the word for faith in Hebrew is emunah, which is based on the root aman. That's why we say amen, because aman means to be reliable or sure. And when you say amen, that's reliable, it's sure, it's true. I agree with that. Fine. And the word for truth in Hebrew is from the same root. It's emet, which is something that you can depend upon. So when God saved Noah, and he sets up this covenant, when Noah offers a covenant sacrifice, and God gives Noah, at the beginning of chapter 9, covenant stipulations, things that he's got to obey, not very many. One of them is to not eat the meat with the blood in it, okay? And he gives him just a few of these things. Does Noah have to exercise faith? Well, yes, he needs to exercise faith that God will keep on going, providing for him. But the rainbow, see, is a reminder that, yes, God is remembering me every time I see that rainbow. And I've seen some beautiful ones recently. So, does Noah need to exercise faith? Not without evidence. See? He can trust on something that's reliable and sure, and God is asking him to cooperate with him because he's already delivered. Now, of course, earlier he had to cooperate in building the ark, right? But now he's being delivered, and the same thing is true. Look at this pattern. Abraham is already spared from danger when he rescues Lot in chapter 14. In chapter 15, God establishes the covenant with him. See the order? What about the Israelites? They were already delivered from Egypt. In fact, in chapter 20 of Leviticus, just before the Ten Commandments, God says, I'm the one who, I brought you out of Egypt. I delivered you on eagle's wings. Now, therefore, see, this is like the historical prologue to the treaty. Therefore, don't have any other gods before me. So God is providing us a very logical way. I mean, he is not just saying, oh, by the way, if you did this, then this will happen, like a lot of salesmen do these days. And politicians, they promise the world, and you don't know if they're going to deliver. We know that God is going to deliver. And because he's done this big deliverance, we know he's going to continue delivering. See, he's established a pattern. It's like, look, I'm a professor with tenure. You understand what tenure is? Sorry? Yeah, you can't just be summarily fired real easily. Yeah. Now, how do you get tenure? Well, you have to establish a track record. I'm going to be a productive scholar. I show that I am a productive scholar. I'm going to mentor students well. I'm going to get on with my colleagues, right? And once you get to that point, then it's expected that you will continue to do the same, right? And so that's what God, when there's a covenant established like that, it's like giving God tenure. I never thought of it quite that way. But anyway. No, ask it. Don't try to hold it. This was part of the journey of faith of Abraham. And there's a wonderful book that traces this journey of faith. It's called Genesis, and then the subtitle is The Story We Haven't Heard. Genesis, The Story We Haven't Heard. It's published by InterVarsity Press a few years ago, and I wrote a review on it. And I'm trying to remember the author. When I remember that, I'll tell you. Okay? And in this book is written by actually a literature professor who has some good friends who are Hebrew scholars. And he traces through the whole of Genesis, but it's particular. I'm going to tell you about what he says about Abraham. And that is, Abraham had to learn to trust in God. He didn't right away. God told him, get going. Okay, so he gets going, and he trusts God in that sense. But then in Genesis 12 already, the first thing that happens is there's a famine, gets to the promised land, goes down into Egypt, and he's afraid for his own skin, to the point that he allows his wife to be taken into the harem of Pharaoh, see, because he's not willing to trust God. He cares about his own skin more than he does his wife's integrity. This is serious for the covenant, you know. It's covenant jeopardy. Then various things happen. One of the pretty major things was here in chapter 14, though. Because in chapter 14, there was a coalition of kings who came from Mesopotamia and elsewhere, and they captured Lot and his family and other people from that region where Abraham was. He was living up in the hill, in the country, not down in the city. And Lot had thrown in his lot, shall we say, with the people down in Sodom. And so he had been captured with his family. And so Abraham took, and with a very small force of about 300 trained servants, they divided themselves up, and they surprised the enemy, and they defeated this much larger force, and they got back Lot and the others, and a lot of booty, and all of the rest. Extraordinarily dangerous situation. This was a military battle with a coalition of kings. Now, they were probably, not emperors, but kings of city-states. And obviously, God was working with him and helping him. And at the beginning of chapter 15, God reveals himself to Abraham, and we could, if I could get to my computer easier, I could show it. But if you look there in chapter 15, God says to him, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward, meaning I am your protection, which had just happened. See, he's referring to what just happened. And then he says, now, and then he sets up the covenant. And there's another phase of the covenant in chapter 17. But what happens in chapter 16? See? Abraham hasn't finished his journey of faith yet, just because the covenant is set up. Neither had Noah. What did Noah do after that point? Do you remember what Noah did? Yeah, he got drunk and made a fool out of himself. Okay. But Abraham, you see, how is God going to have a line of descendants through me? And Abraham said in chapter 15, well, Eliezer of Damascus, my servant, you can use him, because I'm dried up, my wife and I are barren. It was Sarah's problem with fertility, not Abraham's. After Sarah died, when Abraham was old, he had more children. Midianites, for example, by Keturah, which was a real shame. Okay? You hear the song, Father Abraham had many sons had well, Father Abraham had a few too many sons in some ways, because Midian, after, the Midianites, they gave terrible trouble to the Israelites. Okay, and so, in any case, Abraham decided to take it into his own hands. As Sarah said, there's a solution. Take my maid Hagar. That happens in chapter 16. So he hasn't yet fully depended upon God, and he's growing, and it culminates. The journey of faith is in Genesis 22. It culminates there, where he's willing to give up on his entire future because he hears the voice of God. Now, it's not the first time God speaks to him. He knows that voice. He knows it's God. Okay? And God says, take now your son, and then God rubs it in, your only son, and then he rubs it in again, whom you love. And take him to Mount Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering. This is a pinnacle of faith, and it's celebrated in Jewish literature. I've read the Jewish Midrash, which is homiletical exposition on that. It's wonderful stuff. And so Abraham reaches the point where he's willing to give to God his entire future. Right? Because Isaac, everything is wrapped up in this boy. All the promises, this young man, he may have been 40 years old. All of the promises, everything, and yet he's willing to give it up to God. That faith and trust in God. So, but this covenant inauguration is a crucial stage in the process. Does that help a little bit? Okay, good. All right, discussion question. When we give rules to our children and youth, do we place them within a covenant framework? That is, the rules. Do we say, you got to do it because I said so? We have? Yeah, sure we have. All right, okay. But what if we place it within a covenant framework? That is within the framework of a relationship between the parent and the child, or within the relationship of God and the child? That's going to really strengthen things. Because when we try to dictate standards to those who don't understand the larger framework, then it becomes legalism, doesn't it? Often. We raise a lot of legalists, and they often overreact later and throw it off. What do you think? Are we onto something that makes sense to pursue? So I think we should be very careful, particularly with little tiny kids, that they understand what the big picture is all about. They can grasp something of the big picture. Our daughter did, and she used to lead our family to worship. She loved worship. She would call us to worship. And yes, and as I was saying this last week, we got through Genesis and we got through Exodus, no trouble. Hit Leviticus, my specialty. I was looking forward to explain it. Brick wall. Because animals get hurt. She understands it now, but it was too much then. Okay, in any case, when we give rules to children and youth, and also others, when there are others that we're mentoring, babies in the faith, whatever the faith may be, we need to have them see the big picture. It's not just because, look, we're a group and this is the rule and that's it. You obey or you're out. No, let's see it in the relationship. Okay, obedience. Let's talk about obedience. Laws benefit those who keep them. That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? In other words, you shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. I am the Lord. That's not talking about eternal salvation living after you've already blown it. This is talking about cause and effect. You'll live long in the land. You'll be prosperous. You'll be well off if you keep the law. See? But this is not telling you that you legalistically, by doing these things, can have salvation in the ultimate sense of forgiveness and atonement and all of that. Further obedience doesn't atone for failure. It just doesn't. Okay. Then when there's failure, see, laws can't help those who break them. We're just on the mercy of God. David, Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God. Renew my heart. Create a right spirit within me. It's just all up to God's mercy. Only God's mercy can remedy failure. Okay, discussion question. How is it possible for us to obey God's law? How can we possibly obey? Isn't it way too high a standard? You're shaking your head. No, it's not too high a standard. How many people think God's law is too high a standard, cannot be kept? Well, it depends what you mean. Depends what you mean. Like many things in life. How many people think that you can keep God's law in your own strength? That you have the willpower? You can sit and meditate, transcendental meditation? We need transcendental medication, right? We need help to obey. Does that make sense? And when God asks us to do something, it's unreasonable to ask somebody to do something or require them to and judge them for it and hold them accountable if it's too hard for them with your help, right? That would be very unreasonable and cruel and vicious and unjust. But when God asks us to do something, he makes a way for that to happen. So anytime we see a requirement by God, we're also seeing with it a promise to help us live in that way. When God says, you shall be, in various ways, I'm paraphrasing, you shall be sexually pure. Okay? Rather than looking at it, oh no, that's just something that's too difficult. I went to UC Berkeley, and when I was there were more unmarried couples living together than any other community in the whole country. And I got to tell you one thing. My wife and I were walking across the campus holding hands. That's something people in Berkeley didn't ever do. They didn't show physical affection in public. They just slept together at night. And so we were walking across campus, holding hands, just happy, newly married couple. And we walked past Swami X. Now, Swami X, that was his nickname. He was a guy who used to run at the mouth, and he would imitate people, and he would make fun of anything in heaven above or earth beneath or under the earth. And this guy used to entertain students, and he had a huge crowd of about 100 students. He would imitate the way people walked, whatever, and everyone would laugh, and he would make fun of things, and we walked by holding hands. As we did so, he stopped and looked at us, and we knew we were next. We were the next target. And everyone turns to look where he looks, see? 100 or so students. And he says, "Do I detect some physical contact?" And everyone laughs. This is crazy. Berkeley, everyone's sleeping together, and we're holding hands? Come on, give us a break. But anyway, do I detect some physical contact? And they all laugh. And then my wife and I both knew instinctively what to do without saying a word. I just leant her over and gave her a big stage kiss, like from Gone with the Wind. And everyone whistled and hollered and shouted, and they just loved it. And he was totally defeated, and all he could say was, "Yuck." Yes, go marriage. Let's have some marriage for a change, huh? Okay, how did I get onto that? All right, let's go on. Obedience. We can't obey on our own. Deuteronomy 31, Moses tells the people, God tells Moses, and Moses tells the people, you are going to fail in future history. You're going to go into the promised land, and you're going to blow it. And Deuteronomy 31 says so. And it's quite clear that the reason why they would fail is because they would depart from God. And that's exactly what happened in the book of Judges. Yes. I don't like it. The fact that they failed, you like that? Oh, I'm just giving you a hard time. Go ahead. That's okay. Right. Mm. Yeah, Daniel was a God-empowered person. So was Joseph. And it's because they were connected with God that they were able to purpose in their heart. We didn't have the willpower. I mean, that was a very intimidating situation. If you even go, I don't know if you've been to the Middle East, but if someone like a Bedouin, particularly in that culture, offers you invites you in, and they offer you something, you eat it or you drink it or you offend them. Okay, so I don't normally drink, say, coffee, for example. I don't like it, and I don't want to take caffeine because I'm hyper enough already. Okay, so my wife would agree. Some people are hyperactive. I tend to be radioactive. But I've drunk Turkish coffee when a Bedouin offered it to me. See, it's hospitality, and you receive hospitality because that says something about the relationship. Otherwise, you're rejecting that person. Now, in our culture, we understand things differently. If someone offers you something and you don't need it right then, thanks, I'm fine and appreciate that, but not in those cultures. When it is a king who has taken you captive and slaughtered a lot of your people, and he has given you what he regards as a huge favor, see, you're talking about serious consequences, see? And it was only because David was connected with God that he had the courage. The purposing in his heart was really to receive the gift of trusting in God, that God was going to take care of him, and he didn't know how. That make sense? Okay. But in other words, we have to cooperate with God. We have to receive the gift, and it can be challenging. It can be scary, and it can involve sweat, blood, toil, tears, and sweat, all of the above. But we're still receiving a gift, aren't we? Because without that gift, it's all over. Yes? Confidence. We don't have confidence. Yes, right. You know, I have I guess you'd call her ex-sister-in-law in Australia, who is a nutrition expert, and she helps people overcome lifestyle issues with diet, okay? The biggest problem that she's found is human willpower. Just the will to do what they need to do. They can know cognitively, intellectually what they need to do, but they just can't change those habits, all right? Okay. Obedience is a gift. Deuteronomy 30. Moses says, surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you this day is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It's not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to observe it. What he's saying is obedience is accessible. It's something you can do by God's grace. And that's something we need to remember. And I love a passage in the New Testament. It's Jude, the little book of Jude, just before Revelation, Jude verse 24. It says, now unto him who is what? Able to keep you from falling. Do we believe God created us? He's poured out heaven to save us. And he says, I'm able to keep you from falling. Do we really believe that? See? A lot of times people think that sinning is like breathing. You know, I just sin automatically. No, that's not true. God is really able to keep you from falling. Sorry? And to present you faultless before the throne of grace. Very good, thank you. Okay, how do you feel about God's law? What keeps us from obeying? Well, remember we started off with the question in this presentation with remember the picture of the judge with the gavel, right? And we asked the question, how do you feel about God's law? Well, now, after this discussion this morning and today until now how do you feel about God's law? And what keeps us from obeying God? Do you feel any differently about God's law than before we reviewed these biblical principles? Any changed views, or you already knew all this? You didn't need to come here today. Sorry? Or needed reminding. Okay, so maybe perhaps you had an idea that this was basically true, but you needed some sharpening up and reminding of the sources where it comes from. Is that sort of where we're at? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding in that respect. What keeps us from obeying God? I mean, do we ever fail to obey God? Yes, I'm seeing some nodding heads again, and you see my head is nodding too. What keeps us from obeying God all the time? Free will, absolutely.
That's the free will only comes down to one decision. And that one decision is will I obey or will I disobey? And once you've answered that question, there isn't any other discussion to have. You know, you obey what he said obey, or
Okay, so the comment here from Sandy was that we have free will, and the decision is either to obey or not to obey, and that's up to us. So the problem is really with our willpower, isn't it? With our choices. Now, see, if we knew the beginning from the end and we knew everything like God does, perhaps it would be a bit easier. But we often get kind of myopic. You know, you see, I wear glasses. I used to wear contact lenses, but and that's because I'm short-sighted. Yeah, I take this off, and you're all a little bit grainy, okay? And so, consequently, I have these. So it's because we're short-sighted. We're seeing what's close to us. I'm reminded of when I was working on the grounds department at Pacific Union College when I was in college years ago. Beautiful campus, and one of the things that I had to do, because I was a foreman at that point, I had to make sure we didn't have stray dogs roaming around because they would make messes and tear up landscapes, see? And there was a dog that was there, and I was supposed to take the dog and take it to where it needed to go. Okay, not hurt it or anything, but just, I had a pickup that I was commissioned to use, and so I saw this dog. So I went and I got some dog biscuits, and the dog looked like, from its shape, it looked like it appreciated things like that. And so I went to the dog, and I just threw a dog biscuit. Dog ate it, just right away, ate it. Threw another dog biscuit a little bit closer. Dog ate it. Another a little closer, ate it. Threw another one in my truck. Dog jumped in the truck. I drove away, took it where I needed to go. See? Now, isn't that kind of the way we work? We're focusing on that dog biscuit, right? And so we can get caught real easily because we're myopic. And that's the way it was with the Israelites. They were always thinking about their bellies. You notice that? They were afraid for the next meal or the next drink. And as a result, it was easy for them to lose faith in the big picture. Caleb was the one, he'd been let out of captivity. He got the big picture. See, he wasn't a slave at heart anymore. The rest of them were still slaves at heart. But Caleb, he looked up and praised the God that set him free. He saw that glory cloud. He focused on that. He didn't look around and pick holes in Moses or Aaron, or look at all the things that were dangerous and all the things that weren't happening. He looked at God. Caleb, by the way, you know what his name means? Dog. Yeah, name means dog. Okay. All right. So, yes. Mm. Yes. And that's something, see, we have to pass on to our children. That's why it says in Deuteronomy that God commanded the Israelites through Moses to teach their children all the time about what God had done for them. In other words, place those laws in the covenant framework. We said that the law has a historical prologue, right? Introduction. That's what we have to teach everyone. The narrative, the story of our deliverance. And that's why Jewish people still celebrate Passover. Okay? That's why Christians celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion. And that's to remember and to help our children remember that everything God asks us to do is always, only, ever within that framework. We're saved by grace through faith. And we're judged on one thing, and that is how we receive the gift. Receiving the gift, yes, it takes purposing in your heart, like Daniel did. It takes a lot of effort and wrestling with God in some cases. You look at Jacob and so on. But it's only ever receiving the gift, really. That was the point Caleb made. He says in Numbers 13, the land is a good land, and we are well able to go up and possess it. See? We. He included God in we. That was the difference between him and the 10 scouts. And so what he was saying was, the land already belongs to us. We just got to go up and take it. Yes, and Caleb takes the worst neighborhood. He takes Hebron, where the giants were. The Hebron, you've heard of the San Francisco giants. This is the Hebron giants. They were nasty dudes. And what did he do? Caleb, with dogged determination, hounded those giants out of town. Yeah, that's good stuff. Yes, I saw a comment here. Absolutely. Disobedience is a result of lack of faith all the way through. Yeah. And Habakkuk in Habakkuk 2 says, the just will live by his faith. And if a person doesn't have faith, I will have no pleasure in him. And there are passages like Numbers 15, starting with verse 37 to about 42, where God commanded the Israelites to have these tassels on the hems of their garments, and it had a mixed wool and linen thread in it. Wool and linen, that mixture was otherwise reserved for the priests. Mixtures were reserved for the priestly realm, and you find those mixtures in the sanctuary as well. But every Israelite had those tassels, which had that mixture to show they were a kingdom of priests and a holy people. They were connected with the holy realm, and they were thereby to remember, not to just go after wherever their eyes led, but to have faith and trust in God so that they would obey him. So it really makes clear the connection between faith and obedience. And of course, the reason why the people didn't obey God to go up and take the land that was already theirs is because they didn't lack faith. They said, we can't do it. So they didn't accept the gift. Very good point. Thank you so much. Yes? You didn't have a point? You were just stretching? It's okay. It's okay. Yes? Faith is what? Doesn't have a verb. Well, I've heard of people saying that we're faithing life. Yes. Faithing life one day at a time. That's good. Okay, I think we're done with what can we do about this? What can we do about what keeps us from obeying God? How do we remedy the problem? Greater. Say it, brother. What do we need more of? Faith. We need more faith and trust. How do we get more faith and trust? We ask for it, right? And if we ask for it and exercise the faith that we have, it's going to grow. What will happen is that we will see evidences for faith show up. Look at the fact of what when the priests carrying the ark got to the flooded Jordan River. It was very dangerous. Really dangerous. I've been to the Jordan River, and it's just a puny stream now. But in those days, it was really quite a torrent. And they were going to be swept away to their deaths. But what did God command them to do? Step in the water. Get your feet wet. See? And then it opens up. And I found that to be true in my own life. I just got to keep on going where I know God is leading me, get my feet wet, stick my neck out, whatever, make myself vulnerable, and He takes care of the rest. And our faith grows. Wow, if He can do that, then He can do other things as well. And our relationship with Him grows just like with our partners. We depend upon our friends, our spouses, those that we love, more and more and more until we really trust our lives with them. See? And this has to happen in the military. Any veterans here? You got to trust your life to your buddies, huh? I know some veterans. Okay, that was the end of what results do we expect? Good things, right? What we're looking for ultimately is, like the Israelites in the book of Numbers, we're going to the promised land. The book of Numbers, I wrote a book about that, In the Shadow of the Shekinah, God's journey with us. And in the book of Numbers, they faced so many things that we face. Crises over faith and leadership and all kinds of things that they had to deal with out there in the wilderness. And they blew it, and then finally they got it, and these kind of things. And generations passed, and finally they got to go into the promised land after the book of Numbers. So we are journeying to the ultimate promised land. The Hebrew Bible promises that, Isaiah 66, for example. The New Testament promises that, Revelation 21 and 22. That's where I want to be going. The tree of life is back there in Genesis. Revelation promises the restoration of the tree of life. That's what I want. We had a great potluck today, right? Amen. Appreciated it. But, why are we here on earth eating our food when we should be eating from the tree of life? We need to go home. It's time. Okay, that's just some more things that I wrote, and we're going to shift to the final PowerPoint presentation and go through that. And this one isn't as long. We'll take some questions then. But question now. Pardon me for pointing. I guess I do that as a teacher. My wife tells me not to point. I don't mean to be rude. Okay. Tzitzit are tassels. Plural. Do we have a Bible here? I could pull up the Hebrew. The question is, in the text, Numbers 15, 37 to 42 or so, does it mention wool and linen? That's what I recall from Jacob Milgram, my teacher, has written about this. That's in Leviticus 19. But I'm talking about Leviticus 15, verses 37 to 42. And thank you. Yes. Now it says put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. You're right. It doesn't mention explicitly the linen and wool. However, the blue thread had to be linen, didn't it? Because you don't dye wool. Well, I guess you could dye wool. In any case, I'm getting this idea from my teacher Jacob Milgram for his exposition of that in his commentary, that this was a woolen linen mix, and how he got that, I'll have to go back and review that. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was elsewhere, that's in Deuteronomy to do that. In any case, my point especially was to remember their holiness. Now, the interesting thing is, in Luke, is it Luke chapter 8? Thank you. In Luke chapter 8, where a woman touches of Jesus' garment, the hem, it's really the tassel. It's really the tassel that signifies his holiness. And she came trembling because she was afraid that she had contaminated the holy teacher with physical ritual impurity, which would make him impure. Therefore, he couldn't engage in worship like holy teachers engage in a lot of worship. He couldn't go to the temple and do sacrifices and all of that, and that would be a problem. And so when he says, "Who touched me?" which is a ridiculous question in an ancient Near Eastern crowd, or a modern, I've been in such a crowd, in Bethlehem on Christmas Eve, all pushing and shoving. And anyway, that's another story. But who touched me? And she got it. She knew. He understands. He knows that I touched him and I've been impure. Look at Leviticus 15, right? Leviticus 15. And so consequently, that's why she came. And it was the tassel that she had touched. Yeah, it makes it much more powerful when you realize that. Thank you for that comment. Okay. The gospel according to Moses. Okay, we've seen this purpose of the series. What God wants from you. Uncertainty and stress. I mentioned this before this week, but here is the actual quotations. An Egyptian begged to God for mercy. "Visit not my many offenses upon me. I am one ignorant of himself. I'm a mindless man who all day follows his mouth like an ox after grass." Here is that's in the context of Scripture. Okay, a Mesopotamian, Babylonian or something like that, expressed his dilemma. "I wish I knew that these things were pleasing to a God. What seems good to oneself could be an offense to a God. What in one's own heart seems abominable could be good to one's God." I talked about that this morning. Tremendous insecurity and terrible stress. Fear of the gods, superstition. But with the God of Israel, it is alleviated. The question in Deuteronomy is, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God demand of you?" Okay? And we're going to get an answer, and the answer is, only this. Okay, things are going to be real simple. So you don't have to be in all this stress. There's only one God you deal with. He tells you what he wants. And he summarizes it right here. Only this, to revere the Lord your God, to walk only in his paths, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, keeping the Lord's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today for your good. See, so it's pretty comprehensive. Obey God in these ways, but also, notice, love him. Walk in his paths, which requires faith. When you're entering a promised land infested with giants and where there are 12 cities and so on. Now, there's another question in Micah 6, which you're maybe more familiar with, and it's basically a similar kind of question. With what shall I approach the Lord? Do homage to God on high. And then it's giving a series of possibilities. Shall I approach him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? Let's up the ante here. With myriads of streams of oil, shall I give, my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? This is like Mesha, king of Moab, in 2 Kings 3. And he was besieged by a coalition of Israel and so on. And he offered his firstborn son, the heir to the throne, on the city wall. And it was a terrible thing. Okay, is this what God wants from us? Here's the answer. He has told you. Okay, you already know what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Only to do justice, to love goodness, to walk modestly. It's generally translated humbly. Okay, this is the JPS, New Jewish Publication Society version. The word is hatznea. It's hifil of tzana. And scholars debate about what exactly it means, but it has something to do with walking prudently or circumspectly or appropriately, something like that, And they put modestly, with your God. Then will your name achieve wisdom. So we have three things here. Do justice, love goodness. That word for goodness is chesed, which is often translated love or loving kindness or covenant loyalty. That's the idea. It's a very big term. It's really the central term of the whole Hebrew Bible in a sense, because God has that chesed. And then walk modestly with your God. Three things. This is in Micah, one of the prophets. He says, you know. So he's summarizing teaching that the people already know. So the source really ultimately is Torah. Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Do justice, and here it is. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly. Leviticus 19. That's one example of do justice. And it's already there way back in Leviticus. Another one, love goodness. Here's the second one. Source, Leviticus 19:18. You shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. Okay? Loving goodness means to nurture loving kindness towards others. An attitude of loving kindness, covenant loyalty. And it isn't just about nice romantic feelings. It's about really treating a person well. Deal loyally with your servant. See, that's what people say to each other. Treat me appropriately, well, according to the way I've treated you, which includes mercy and all of those things. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself. Notice, love your fellow as yourself. That's your fellow Israelite. We don't generally look at this verse, but this verse is saying not only your fellow Israelite, but the one who comes in, the resident alien, who doesn't have all the rights of citizenship. Love that person as yourself. Treat that person as a citizen. That's amazing. God was thereby wanting to draw other people into that community of faith, to demonstrate that he is inclusive, and he wants everyone to enjoy those covenant benefits. Isn't that incredible? What application does that have for us today? See? We could do a lot. Sorry? That's what lets us in. We could do a lot more of that. Not just on the political arena of resident aliens, and there's a lot of political discussion about amnesty for various kinds of people and so on. But also in any group that we're in. Love that person outside as much as you love the people inside that group. Don't discriminate against someone because they're not in that group. Okay? Very, very powerful. And it's right there in the Torah. Walk modestly or humbly with your God. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noah walked with God. Okay? So you see what that does. Earlier in the Bible, it tells us that Enoch walked with God, back in chapter 5 of Genesis. But this one is telling us what walking with God means. A righteous man, blameless. That's what it means to walk with God. He's righteous before God. You can be righteous before God, not in your own strength, but if you're in harmony with him in your life and everything, then you can be. Walking means living. And still, in Jewish teaching, halacha, which means walking, is a term for standards of living, the way you live. That's halacha, walking. Okay, when Avram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Avram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. See, be blameless, similarly. Keep on walking. Abraham, I told you to walk out here, out of your land, from your country people's place there in Mesopotamia. Keep on walking before me. That involves not just obedience, it involves faith. Incredible amount of trust. Walk there, even though, there's all kind of people out there, you may get in trouble, but God is with you. And that's the greatest promise, that God is with you. Abraham needed a lot of faith because look at what his name means. You know what his name means? Anybody? Av means father. Ram means big or great. His name means Big Daddy. Hey, Big Daddy, how many kids you have? Oh, well, sort of none. Oh, that's hilarious. See, it was hard to take, poor guy. His name was a reminder of the problem. Okay, and interestingly speaking, God made a covenant not just with Abraham, but with Abraham and Sarah together. A scholar by the name of Tamara Cohen Eskenazi pointed that out in a lecture series I attended in a temple in South Bend. And she pointed out, it was Sarah that was barren. Abraham didn't have a fertility problem. But God wanted to make sure it was that original marriage of Abraham that was honored with the covenant child. Okay, that was a side point, but I think it bears speaking. The source is Torah. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways. There it is again. to keep his commandments, his laws, his rules, that you may thrive and increase, that the Lord your God may bless you in the land that you're about to enter and possess. What a wonderful promise. See? And that promise really is remaining for us. It'll be fulfilled in a different way, but we still have, in a more ultimate way, the Bible promises a better land, and that's what we want. Even better than Gainesville. That's hard to imagine. Okay. And the alligators will be tame, I assume, huh? Okay. All right. Categories of law. Traditionally, since the early Christian centuries, Christians have divided up laws into some of these categories: moral, and which includes permanent universal principles governing relationships. A paramount example is the Ten Commandments, which isn't the sum total of all moral law, but they're examples of major categories of moral law. There are other moral laws which aren't included in the Ten Commandments. For example, don't oppress your neighbor. The law against lying, telling an untruth, is in Leviticus 19:11. It's not in the Ten Commandments. The ninth commandment, don't bear false witness, is related to that, but it's a judicial. Don't bear witness in a court of law. So the basic command against lying, per se, is in Leviticus 19. There are sexual laws in Leviticus 18 and 20, which are not specifically, explicitly covered by the seventh commandment. You shall not commit adultery. Lo tin oath is to commit adultery. It says nothing about bestiality, homosexual practice, incest, the things that are covered in Leviticus 18 and 20. So the Ten Commandments are examples. Ritual or ceremonial law regulates the ritual worship system, which is no longer with us today because the temple and the sanctuary are gone. Okay. Civil law applies permanent principles. Okay. But there are specifics and penalties under the Israelite theocracy. So the laws, the way they're written, the way they're formulated, can no longer actually be applied that way. But they embody principles that we can learn from. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, if you have a house with a flat roof, you have to build a parapet or a railing around there so nobody falls off and gets hurt. What's the basic principle for that? Respect for life, which is the basic principle behind the sixth commandment: you shall not commit murder. The sixth commandment doesn't say you shall not kill, it says you shall not murder. It doesn't rule out killing animals for food in legitimate cases or capital punishment and things like that. It rules out murder. Okay, so there is penalties like stoning that may not apply. You could have a law that looks like it wouldn't apply at all, but if we dig, we find an underlying principle. I'll give you some examples of that, okay? So you have, for example, in the Ten Commandments, you shall not murder. In Exodus, it says if a person strikes a person so that he dies, that person shall be put to death. Okay, capital punishment by stoning for that particular crime. Okay, so the penalty is under the theocracy, which is the rule by God. There was no separation of church and state. God is running the country. And under that judicial system, those penalties would apply. Today, a person could be just as guilty before God of doing these things, but who's going to put them to death? We don't have a theocracy. Unfortunately, you see, that was a real theocracy, right? God was really there. His presence was in the sanctuary. And he was pushing the accelerator or pushing the brake. Saul, in misguided zeal, tried to wipe out the Gibeonites, who were a Canaanite group, and there was an oath, and they weren't supposed. There was an oath of protection. But he tries to kill those people. And God's law protects them, and God punishes Saul for doing that, see, which was an act of genocide. God is controlling all of these things. But there's no theocracy since God was in charge of the Israelites. However, groups have claimed to be theocracies, which is awfully dangerous. And that includes the Church of the Middle Ages. It includes the Taliban. The Taliban claims to be a theocracy. See? And it includes the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this is a very, very challenging thing. There are people today who would like to make America into a theocracy. And that scares the daylights out of me. Okay? All right. Separation of church and state is very crucial. Health. There are no health motivations for any specific laws in the Pentateuch, but if you obey all my laws, none of these diseases will come upon you. That's in Exodus 15 and in Deuteronomy. I have a whole presentation on that we can't get into. No health motivations for specific laws, but there are health implications. For example, in Deuteronomy, I think it's 23, it says, if you got to go to the bathroom, take a stick, go outside the camp and do it out there, so the Lord will not be disgusted. It doesn't say, because otherwise there may be fecal contamination, and as a result you may get bubonic plague. That's what happened in the Middle Ages, see, and a third of the population of Europe died, but not the Jewish people that washed their hands before eating. See? So there are health benefits and implications which have blessed the Jewish people. Not eating those unclean animals and keeping the laws of kosher, not eating the meat with the blood, have affected health, and they've helped health. See? But that's not the reason given in the Pentateuch, because it was a pre-modern scientific culture. They didn't have microscopes. God gave them reasons that were other reasons, but the laws can apply, they can be ongoing, because our human bodies function the same. So those are different categories of law. There's no sharp distinction here between sacred and secular. Religious laws appear in other contexts. There's an amazing mixture of laws. In Leviticus 19, keep all of God's commandments is the implication. Doesn't matter what category it belongs to. You need to keep that law. And some laws can belong to more than one category, can't they? What about the Sabbath? Part of the Ten Commandments, moral law between God and humans. Does it impact health? Yes, Exodus 23. That even your ox and your donkey may be refreshed. See? They're not necessarily gaining a spiritual blessing in the same way, but they're refreshed physically. Numbers 15, a person in Numbers 15, 32 to 36, is held accountable for gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. Under the theocracy, under civil law, he's held accountable. What about ritual law? Ritual law honors the Sabbath, because there's an extra morning and evening burnt offering, and the bread of the presence is changed on the Sabbath, you see? So the Sabbath, in a sense, relates to all four of these categories. Some of those categories are no longer relevant because the temple is no longer there. The theocracy is no longer there. But our bodies are the same, so we gain a health benefit from the Sabbath, right? And it's still a moral requirement. So if you take off 2 out of 4 hats, you've still got a hat on, right? It still applies. Yes. Okay, question is about trial by ordeal. And you've obviously read some of ancient documents, Hammurabi's code and so on. There is something in Hammurabi's law code. If there's a charge of sorcery, someone charges somebody else with doing sorcery, which is black magic, and it's very dangerous. It was regarded as having a high caliber weapon of mass destruction. Okay? Taken very seriously. Curses you don't mess around with. Also in the Hebrew Bible. We've got to realize that. If you curse the king or your parents, you're put to death. Why? Because the curse is a serious weapon. All right. Now, if a person charges someone and says, you are a sorcerer, this is like a witch hunt, right? Like looking for witches in Salem, Massachusetts. And it's shown, well, and then what happens is, how do you find out if they're really a sorceress or a sorcerer? Well, they would put the person in the river. The person would have to leap into the Euphrates River. If they drowned, they were guilty. If they lived, they were innocent. See? Real simple. It worked real well until people learned how to swim. And so in any case, yeah, if you want to do those things, you got to swim. There is a somewhat analogous situation in Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 to 31, the rule of the suspected adulteress. Why is there no corresponding law about a suspected adulterer? That is, when a man suspects his wife of committing adultery, but he doesn't have any proof, he just has this terrible paranoia. I call it porneia paranoia, because porneia is the Greek word for fornication, okay? Porneia paranoia. And he suspects his wife. It's going to hurt the marriage, right? Absolutely. There's suspicion there. And so how is this going to be resolved? Well, why isn't there a corresponding ritual if a wife suspects her husband? It's not fair. Jacob Milgram, my teacher, has pointed out the reason in his JPS Torah commentary on Numbers. The courts were controlled by men. An innocent woman could be lynched by an all-male court who would favor the man. God didn't allow that. It's the only case in which it automatically goes to the Supreme Court. Only women had the right to a Supreme Court justice trial before God at the sanctuary. God himself decides. And it's a complicated case. I could spend a lot of time on it, but in a nutshell, it's a litmus test, kind of like the way a pregnancy test works. The woman takes into her body holy water mixed with the dust from the floor of the sanctuary, holy precincts. And other things happen in the words of a conditional curse. She drinks this. Holiness is not allowed to come in contact with impurity. If she's morally impure, then it causes a bad reaction. Her uterus prolapses and so on. She can't bear children. It doesn't say she's put to death, but it's like the equivalent of having a big letter A, scarlet letter A. You've heard of the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne? A huge stigma, and it's a fate almost worse than death. But the point there is that God, in this very unusual ritual, which has some parallels to other ancient Near Eastern rituals, it's a situation where God is setting up a situation in which he makes the decision to the satisfaction of the man, and the marriage can be healed. Because you see, the man will understand that if God says that my wife hasn't been unfaithful, she really hasn't been unfaithful. And I can feel very confident about that, and so the marriage can be completely healed. Now, a spin-off from that, very briefly, is Luke 7. Luke 7 is very fascinating because there you have remarkable parallels with the story of the law of the suspected adulteress. The suspected adulteress, one thing that happens is, okay, the husband brings for her an offering without frankincense because it's an offering of jealousy. It's an offering to the Lord, but in this situation, it's not a happy offering, so no frankincense, which is sweet incense. Okay? So an offering is brought to the Lord for a verdict, and the priest lets down the hair of the woman. Okay? So her hair hangs down, which rather than being tied up as it normally was out in public. Her hair is let down, and then there's an answer to a question or an accusation by a husband. The Lord decides the verdict. What happens in Luke 7? Here comes a woman. Doesn't say it was Mary Magdalene, although tradition has it that way, and it corresponds with some other stories. But a woman comes to Jesus, and a man accuses her in his mind, and she brings a gift. She lets her hair down. That's all in the story. Wipes his feet with her hair and her tears. And he answers the accusation, renders a verdict. In this case, the verdict is not innocent or just guilty. The verdict is guilty as charged, but forgiven. And the background of that story is that suspected adulterous ritual. It makes it much more powerful if you see the background. Just like with Luke 8, the woman touching the tassel. But this one is especially powerful. So Jesus is taking it one step further. It's not just judging like a judge normally does, innocent or guilty. Guilty, yes, like we're all guilty, but forgiven. And she answers the accuser, the man who's accusing, who is not her husband in this case, answers his thoughts. He raises a question, and he answers his thoughts. Remarkable. Okay, let's go on a little bit here. Holistic approach to life under God. You see, rather than, as I told you with the dietary laws and the health laws, rather than saying, you do this, it's going to be good for this part of the body. No, you do everything, because human beings are whole persons. It's not a cafeteria approach to health or spiritual health, mental health. It's a holistic approach. You don't just pick and choose. Criterion for application. Right here is a criterion for application. A biblical law should be kept to the extent that its principle can be applied. And I came up with this years ago, and I've tested it since then, and I haven't been able to shoot it down yet. One should always try to shoot down one's own theories, right? This one hasn't gone down yet. If you see a problem, let me know. For Christians, see, I formulated this for just the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament adds something in addition, and that is in Acts 15. There's a reason why circumcision is no longer needed as a sign that you belong to God's covenant community. That's in Acts 15. So if you are a Christian, then you would add on to this unless the New Testament removes the reason for its application. Because circumcision could still be practiced today without a temple or a sanctuary. I've been at a circumcision ceremony in Israel of the baby of one of Connie's teachers there. She even was allowed to take pictures of the whole thing, which I was surprised. And so that could be done, but otherwise, a biblical law should be kept to the extent that its principle can be applied. Now, how does that work? First, we identify timeless principles on a case-by-case basis. The aim is to understand a law in its cultural context to bridge the gap to modern culture. Culture is not the authority, but we must take it into account. Now, there was a book that was written by a friend of mine a few years ago called Receiving the Word by Samuel Corenting Pippin. And he's a friend of mine, and he's a very bright person. One thing that I took issue with him before he came out with it, and then it's been published in this book, is that the idea that if you take culture into account when you're applying biblical law, that you are making culture the authority. But what I would say is we have to take culture into account, and I'll show you an example of that, because otherwise we end up with serious problems that are actually unbiblical. We have to take culture into account, but we do so in order to look for the timeless principle. And then that timeless principle translates across to our culture. This was a major thing in the NIV application commentary series as a whole, and I wrote the Leviticus Numbers volume. Each section that I wrote on started with the original meaning of the passage for the people back then. But the second section was bridging contexts. What principles or themes are there that we can then apply in the third section, which is contemporary significance? And you have to do that in a very controlled, careful way. Otherwise, you end up with ridiculous things happening. I'll give you an example. We need to differentiate between timeless principles and culturally conditioned applications or examples. All right. Example 1, levirate marriage. When anyone says, okay, we don't need to take culture into account, just read and do. Have you ever heard anyone do that? They smack their Bible and just read and do. Oh, my answer is Deuteronomy 25, 5-10. Read and do. If two brothers dwell together on an undivided estate, I'm paraphrasing, informed a little bit by Raymond Westbrook's work on biblical law, and one of them dies, leaving a wife without a child, the surviving brother has to take that woman to help her have a child, to continue the name of the dead brother, because otherwise his name will be forgotten, and that's a very bad thing. You've got to continue the name. Well, it doesn't say that he only has to take the woman as his wife. It's a marriage. It doesn't say that he takes her only if he's not already married. Ho, ho, ho. There's the rub, you see. If he's already married, he still has to take her. Now, my other friend, another friend, Ron Dupre, would disagree with me, but it indicates by implication that there could be a situation of creating a dual marriage there. All right? And that would be a terrific problem for us to have massive reform in our group to reinstitute levirate marriage, which is still performed, by the way, in some places in the world like Papua New Guinea, I was told when I was there. It was real interesting to speak to the people there about biblical law, because some of the things that were done in Bible times, they are still doing. So here's an example. What is really the point here? You can see the stories in these chapters about brother-in-law marriage, Ruth and Tamar and Judah. What's the reason for the law? That's what we need to look at in the Israelite cultural context. What's the reason? Well, timeless principles. Here they are. Respect for the dead. And care of widows. We don't do those things in that way. We have other ways to care for widows. We have other ways to respect the dead. We don't have to do levirate marriage. And I'm grateful for that. I mean, my sister-in-law is a nice lady, but anyway, okay, we won't go there. No, that's a relief, you see. But this is an example of the fact that if you just do exactly what you read in a totally different culture, it could have the opposite results than what you intended, and it could be very harmful. Yes? The Year of Living Biblically. My wife and I started to read that. We had some good laughs over that. The Year of Living Biblically. Unfortunately, he doesn't understand the biblical law as well as he could. But so he carried out things very literally with some pretty hilarious results. This is a Jewish journalist. Wearing only white. May your garments always be white. Right. And if taken to their logical conclusions sometimes in our culture, it ends up to be humorous or even damaging. Okay, female vows. Annulment of female vows by fathers or husbands in Numbers 30. Has that ever bothered anyone here? That a female will, in her father's house or in her husband's house, will make a vow to God, but her husband or father can annul that vow when he first hears it. Not later, but when he first hears it, he can annul that vow. Does that bother anyone here? I see some female heads nodding. All right. Well, what's this about? What's the reason for the law in the Israelite context? Timeless principle, respect for the wishes of family members when we contract obligations with God. What were those vows involving in many cases? Offering sacrifices to God. See, you look at Leviticus 7, and there was a votive sacrifice, offering a well-being offering as a sacrifice, which would involve an animal. Where did the animal come from? The family's flock or herd. Animals were the property, the wealth of the family. That'd be like for us, selling stock, pulling out money from the bank account, writing a check. And an animal like a prize bull would be just as valuable to an Israelite family as, or a donkey, Well, the donkey would be not for sacrifice, but the donkey could be given to the priest, for their use and vowed. Okay, it could be just as valuable as my Toyota Corolla. Now, what if my wife vows to God to give our Toyota Corolla, which I'm the one that mainly drives that, to God for His ministry, to Adventist Frontier Mission, or something like this? Whoa, I'm going to be bent out of shape, because I'm going to be riding a bicycle 6 miles to teach at the seminary in the winter in the snow. What God is doing, it was the men who mainly took care of the property and the legal things. What God does, it's amazing, because vows were taken so seriously that Jephthah offered his daughter as a sacrifice in order not to break a vow. That's how serious it is. And in Psalm 15, it says, "Blessed is the man who pays his vow even to his hurt." But here God makes a way out to avoid family conflict. Rather than God saying to himself, well, I would sure like to have that bull, or whatever. God relinquishes that and says, if that's going to cause disharmony in the home, I would rather there be a focus on the family, and let's have that family be intact rather than me getting what is due to me. It's an amazing condescension on the part of God. All right, so God worked with this is important. God worked with existing patriarchal culture rather than engaging in social engineering. And I pointed that out in my book, In the Shadow of the Shekinah. God could have completely changed that society. But if you lead people too fast, beyond what they're ready for, it can be really damaging. Just like Jacob says to Esau, I don't want to go with you with these 400 armed men on horseback or whatever, because the young ones need to go slowly or else they'll get hurt, they'll die, We need to take things at God's pace. Too often we try to rush other people because we're already there and we figure, well, they should be there too. But God was amazingly, amazingly patient with those people. And so when we come to things in the Bible, I remember seeing a man from Utah, I won't say to which group he belonged, on TV years ago, with 5 of his 9 wives. And he had a beard, and he said that he was trying to follow the biblical ideal of patriarchal culture. See? Well, look, the Bible is not mandating patriarchal culture, and certainly never mandating or even condoning polygamy. But that's what God had to work with. He was working with those people, and he works with our culture too. It doesn't mean we have to live in a patriarchal culture. Some people think we do. They don't understand patriarchal culture. They don't know what they're talking about. We have our culture. We live within this culture, applying, translating those laws across those boundaries. We're getting close to the end here. Okay, so it's background. It's not timeless principle. Third, debt servitude, release of temporary servitude of Israelites, especially for debts. Reason for the release, bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. The Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I enjoin this commandment upon you today. So then the timeless principles help those in economic need. We may not have slavery in that way or servitude. It was debt servitude because unlike our society, they could take persons as collateral for debts. You can't go to the bank and say, you know, if I don't pay, then you'll take me as your servant. Maybe if you're in a foreign country and you are traveling, you're a student, you eat a meal, you don't have to pay for it, they'll make you wash dishes in the kitchen. But in ancient times, human beings were collateral for debt, and that's what we're talking about. Help others in economic need, give them an opportunity to start over, as in Leviticus 15, or rather 25, Leviticus 25, the Jubilee, and treat your workers well. Lenders also need to survive, so God sets it up so that they would be willing to lend. We need to emulate God's character. I mentioned before, be holy as I am holy, and there are several places where it says that. We'll go through pretty quickly. And then we get to the end time importance of the Torah. Be mindful, this is in Malachi, right at the end of Malachi, chapter 3 in Hebrew, chapter 4 in English. Be mindful of the teaching of my servant Moses. This is the end of the Old Testament. Now, the end of the Hebrew Bible is 2 Chronicles. But the end of the English Bible, following the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation, which was the Bible of the early church, was this passage. Be mindful of the teaching of my servant Moses. Remember Torah. Don't forget the foundation. Whom I charged at Horeb with laws and rules for all Israel. And then he says, Lo, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of the Lord. Has that day come yet? This is the great day of the Lord. There were lots of days of the Lord, you know, for different countries. And for Israel and Judah, for Babylon, there were days of the Lord. When they faced accountability. You know, you got to face the music. But this is the great, awesome, fearful day of the Lord. And this hasn't happened yet. And what does this Elijah do? He shall reconcile parents with children, children with parents, so that when I come, I do not strike the whole land with utter desolation. This is the end of the Hebrew Bible. Actually, in Hebrew, it actually repeats again, I'll send Elijah. So it ends on an upbeat, and it puts this positive thing rather than the curse. In any case, reconciling fathers to children, children to fathers, it's all based on the principle of what? Love. So here at the end is a reminder. The whole Torah, everything, and the prophets is all about love and reconciliation. This is an end time message, preparation for the great day of the Lord, which hasn't come yet. What does this mean our role is today? Reconciliation. Oh, do we really need that in our society? Is there a need for reconciliation between people? These are just examples. There's a lot of other kinds of people that could be mentioned. You know, husbands and wives and cousins and nephews and uncles and aunts and all the rest of them. And also between generations, you see. Reconciliation with the faith of our fathers. Yeah? It includes that as well. Is there a need for that today? Absolutely. Our society is torn apart. And this is a biblical message. And God is telling us, remember Torah. And then in the same breath, this Elijah is going to come. What does Elijah do? He reminds us of Torah. What did the Elijah in the Bible do when he didn't build an altar from scratch. He rebuilt the old altar. See? It's founded on what's earlier. So we need to go back to our Torah roots. We need to look at that foundation. We need to build on that. And it has end-time relevance for right now. And look, I'm telling you, if we have that love and unity among us, which testifies that God is with us, people are going to be breaking the door down to get in. People want desperately to have a group. There was one young guy I knew. He found out his father was Jewish, and he went in search of an ideal chevra, society. He was looking for the ideal group. He went here and there, and he immigrated to another country. He joined their elite military force to be really part of it. He looked all over for this community. He never really found it. See? And if, by the grace of God, we can be that kind of a community, then people will want to join us. They'll want that kind of support and courage, and it will inspire them, give us confidence. We all need each other. Because look, I have good experiences in my life with God, but hey, if you do too, and you do too, and you do too, and we all share those, that's why it's so important that we tell each other about those things rather than just keeping it to ourselves and always hear a monologue or a performance up front. Right? Okay, I'll get off my grandstand here. That's it. I know we're running a little bit after 7, but I promised if anyone has any questions, I'll try to give you quick answers, anything in the Torah, I guess, at all. Yes? You like to ask hard questions, don't you? Okay, good question. Different interpretations of Jephthah and his daughter. And when I wrote the Bible study guide on this back in 1999, I forget when it came out on Judges, there was a man who took violent issue with me over this. Because I simply read the text as what in Hebrew you'd call a pshat, the plain sense, the plain reading of the text. And that is, it says, Jephthah offered to offer whatever came out from the door of his house as a burnt offering. Later on, he comes back. He has only one daughter, which is his only child, like me. So I really felt this story. And his daughter comes out instead of an animal. Now, why would he have expected? He didn't expect his daughter to come out. He expected an animal. And, he had goats, and he had sheep, and so on, sacrificable animals. Why would he expect an animal to come out from the doors of his house? Well, we know from archaeologists that I work with, they dig in Transjordan, that is the country across the Jordan, in the country of Jordan, that houses in that area had 2 stories, and they kept the animals down below. And the people lived up above. So he would expect when he comes back, one of his animals is going to come to greet him, and he's going to offer that animal as a sacrifice. But instead, his daughter comes out. And then he's terribly upset. And his daughter says, go ahead and do what you've vowed. She goes off into mourning with her friends, other girls, mourning her virginity. See? She was unmarried. That's very significant. And then it says that he did as he had vowed. And the text pulls a veil over it, mercifully. What did he vow? To offer whatever comes out as a burnt offering. He's very upset because it's his daughter, obviously because he knows what he has to do. She agrees to it. And then he does what he had vowed. There is no question he offered his daughter as a burnt offering. Now, when you offer a burnt offering, you don't burn the creature alive. You slit the throat. Let the blood drain out. It's messy, but it's fairly painless because they pass out from loss of blood. And then he would have burned his daughter on an altar. Why did he do it? He hadn't been in my sanctuary class, unfortunately, because he knew the law. He's the only one of the, and he wasn't a rash man. People say his rash vow. Well, it was rash in the sense that he didn't take all the possible consequences into account. He was the only one of the judges in the book of Judges that tried to negotiate with the enemy, telling them the story of past history before going to battle. This is a man who thinks and considers, and he doesn't just rush in. But he didn't consider that possibility because God did such a great victory for the whole nation. He felt totally accountable to do exactly as he had vowed. But he missed an important point. In Exodus, it makes it very clear. If, for example, you have a firstborn animal, which is a donkey is not a sacrificable animal. Is a human girl a sacrificable animal? No. What do you do with a donkey? You redeem it by offering a sacrificable animal in its place. What should you do with a human girl? You redeem her by offering a sacrificial animal in her place. And that's what he missed. But he was so pious and so zealous, he did this painful thing, and he didn't live long after that. About 6 years and he was gone. The reason why she bewailed her virginity, she wouldn't have done it if Arthur Maxwell were right in the Bible story books, or if the man that I was debating with, Leslie Harding, were right, that she was given into sanctuary service, dedicated as a live offering to God at the sanctuary. Samuel was too. Samuel didn't have to remain a virgin. Samuel had sons. That doesn't work. She was a virgin. What was the implication? That was the end of Jephthah's line of descendants. Now, some scholars have tried to say, well, if he actually did human sacrifice, the Bible would have condemned it there. It doesn't need to. Because there's a biblical penalty of being cut off, which means to cut off your line of descendants, deny you an afterlife. He cut off the line of his descendants by his own hand. It's obvious in the text that he received the punishment by his own hand. No need to say anything more. Okay, that was my answer to your question. Okay, any others? Yes, please. You want to talk louder so everyone can hear?
My question is about women when they had their period
Mm-hmm.
in the time of the month, they were considered impure.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember back in Brazil at one point we had somebody from the church that would ask females every time that they were participating in the service if they were having their period. Because if they were, they were not supposed to. So, kind of like,
You're talking about the Lord's Supper? Or communion?
been like reading from
Oh, up front?
up front, or
But what about if they just came in the door to attend church? That wasn't an issue, huh?
I guess you didn't ask everybody.
They didn't ask her. Okay, what she's saying is, in Brazil, there was a man, and this is not an isolated case, there was someone in a Seventh-day Adventist church who was asking personal questions like, what time of the month is it, of females before they were allowed to participate in things like reading scripture from up front and things, or even singing, huh? Or participating in the Lord's Supper, presumably, huh? Communion service? Leading out. Gotcha, okay. All right, let's follow that to its logical conclusions. All right? If that were appropriate to do, let's be biblically appropriate. Let's talk about living biblically, like that guy. What was his name? A.J. Jacobs. Okay, what about men? What about men? Men can be ritually impure. That's in the book of Deuteronomy. Are we all adults here pretty much? You know what I'm talking about, okay? It's not regular. It can happen occasionally, right? What about marital relations? Leviticus 15. So if a man has been with his wife, in that way, very shortly before that, within a day, then the man is impure. Has he bathed and immersed in the proper amount of water? Now let's continue a little bit further. Has anyone ever attended a funeral? Anyone up front ever attended a funeral? Have they been purified with the ashes of the red heifer in Numbers 19? Which requires a reddish heifer and the priest performing a ritual to store up ashes, and then it's sprinkled on the person with water to reconstitute it. It's reconstituted blood, really, because it's a reddish heifer. Then they throw reddish things in it, like cedar wood and crimson wool, and this is reconstituted blood, really, to store it. And this is the only case in which something like purification offering blood is put on the person. It's a different case. Okay, so everybody's impure, right? So look, these rules, we cannot, even if we want, keep the system. Men write the laws. And so, yeah. And you know, it's a very interesting thing. There's a whole tractate, 1/6 of the Mishnah, which is the Pharisaic traditions written down. 1/6 of the Mishnah, which forms the basis of the Talmud, is called Nashim, women. It's about women. And the men are regulating all the details of women's personal lives. See, having control of them. So if we want to be consistent, it doesn't work. Now, there's a very, very good reason why that doesn't matter. We don't have to ask people personal questions. What were you doing last night? What time of the month is it? When they come into church or whatever. Because we're all physically, ritually impure. Right? And it doesn't matter. Because if we're Christians, it doesn't matter. Because the focus of our worship has gone to heaven, Hebrews 7-10. Furthermore, there's no existing sanctuary on earth where there's a resident Shekinah. That's the reason for these purity laws, to protect the boundary around God's presence dwelling in a place on earth. Now the dwelling place is back up in heaven. So the reason for the application of those laws is gone. There was an email that was sent to me about a man who was requiring the women in his household to, during their time of the month, to sit on separate chairs, that nobody else would sit on. Because in Leviticus 15, if you sit on the same chair as someone who has their period, then you become impure. But the same is true about other kinds of impurities, including some that men have too. So there's often a very chauvinistic, kind of weird approach of picking and choosing and trying to exert control. And elitism sometimes is saying, oh, I know this important thing. Look right here. Well, they just don't get the whole picture. So send those people a message back there to tell them, lay off, just forget the whole thing. Okay? And I had earlier, in the earlier series, there was a web address of an article that is online. I've written also maybe we should go back to the end of that previous presentation if we can. The very end, the last slide, and that has some resources, including in my commentary, Leviticus, Numbers, and also there's an article that I wrote that's published at the Biblical Research Institute website. God's moral law, including including the Sabbath. God's moral law, including the Sabbath, in the New Covenant. So what Christians should be applying within the New Covenant in order to be totally appropriate and fair to the Torah, following the principles, the timeless principles as they're applied, but also realizing how the situation has changed in a valid way that is true to God and totally consistent. That's the point of that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. And I talked about that night before last on campus, and some of you may not have been here. I'll just say in a nutshell, very briefly. Like the Methodist minister said, he said, if you get that in your head, you'll have it in a nutshell. Well, anyway. Okay. In any case, physical ritual impurity. And I use the case especially of Leviticus. That's what I'm talking about is the resource I was talking about is particularly that URL right there. That one. See? That article. And it's right there. You go to the Biblical Research Institute website and you look for Gane and you look for that article. And I have a lot of detail on that, including it deals with different categories of law and their application. It also deals with, do we really need to be keeping the seventh-day literal Sabbath now? Because there are those like Pope John Paul II in his encyclical letter Dies Domini, which means the day of the Lord, and Dale Ratzlaff, a former Seventh-day Adventist, in his book called The Sabbath in Crisis, who argue that because we're New Covenant Christians, we don't have to keep the Old Covenant Sabbath. So I deal with that issue, see? And then this is the book about God's journey with us. Leviticus, Numbers, I also deal with this issue I also, in these two, I also deal with the issue of do we have to be keeping the festivals? Okay? All right. And I've got other books, more scholarly book like Cult and Character and Ritual Dynamic Structure, but this is going to help you on these points. What was your last question there again? Remind me. I covered it pretty much? Okay. You have another question? Okay, talk real loud so they can hear right in the back there. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is really, the question is about the timing of the Passover when Jesus died, because Jesus died at the Passover. He's the Passover lamb, according to 1 Corinthians, right? But when exactly was Passover? And there is some difference of perspective among the Gospels in those accounts. And so how do we reconcile those? And I have a real dogmatic answer. I don't know. I'm an Old Testament scholar, and that's a New Testament question. So I know it involves some Old Testament chronological issues, but it's really more a New Testament question. I think the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, for one thing, is pretty good on chronology, and some other commentaries may help as well, but I really don't know the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Oh, could be. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I don't know the answer. You could email people at the Biblical Research Institute. Okay, I know we're getting a bit tired here, and we need to let you go. Just one or two more, and then we'll quit. Okay, yes, please. Okay, Leviticus 19:27. Don't cut the corners of your beard. You don't shave your head. These were apparently, in that context, seemed to be mourning customs for the dead that were practiced by pagans. That's what it appears to be. And so, if by doing that, it was a way like. Sackcloth and ashes and various other kind of things, but it was more particularly mourning for the dead and entering into those rituals. Now, how you dealt with the dead was pretty important, because in Egypt, for example, every tomb was a temple. They thought death was holy because it's a passage to the next life. They believed in the immortality of the soul. But Hebrews didn't believe in the immortality of the soul. The word for soul, nephesh, according to Hans Walter Wolff in his Anthropology of the Old Testament, it never represents, the word nephesh never represents any disembodied intelligent thing. In fact, you find a dead soul in Numbers chapter 6, verse 6, Leviticus 21, verse 11. A dead soul, nephesh mate, is a corpse. That's all. Okay? So there is... In that situation, it's very clear, as I mentioned a few nights ago, that in the Israelite teaching from God, death is an intruder. It was bad. You read Genesis 3. Death starts then. It's a bad thing. It's not always here from the beginning, and we just have to live with it, and it's good. And so God is showing a difference between the way we treat death and the way they treat death. Priests were not allowed to come in contact with dead bodies. Leviticus 21, right? And people had to be purified by the ashes of the red heifer. It was very serious if you didn't. It contaminated the sanctuary, Numbers 19. And this was another thing, these mourning customs for the dead, including scraping oneself. This is what's going on Mount Carmel. Why did they lacerate themselves? Because you read in the Ugaritic Canaanite epic of Baal, and when Baal dies, the god Baal dies, down in the netherworld, then his father, El, the high god El, hears about it, and then he plows his chest like a furrow with scraping himself with his fingernails, cuts himself open to mourn for Baal. What were the priests of Baal doing on Mount Carmel? They're mourning for Baal, following the myth, hoping that thereby they can sort of generate, by sympathetic magic, the next item, which is Baal rises, comes back, and you get fertility back. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Oh, I know what I didn't answer, ritual impurity. Ritual impurity was a category, and I used the analogy of cooties the other night, where it's a conceptual category of things that had to do with the birth to death cycle of mortality that results from sin. So that when, for example, in Leviticus 12, verses 6 to 8, a woman gave birth to a child and she had to offer a sin offering in the translation, it should be translated purification offering, because that sacrifice can purify from moral faults or from physical ritual impurities, which were not moral faults, as we know, because it doesn't say that she receives forgiveness. She only receives physical purification. She doesn't need forgiveness. It's not a sin. Not a sin to have a baby. Huh? What a wonderful thing. Under the right circumstances, of course. God said, be fruitful and multiply. So, okay, maybe we should, oh, one more? Yeah, sorry. Isaiah 7:14. Uh-huh. Okay, so the question is where it says, behold, a virgin shall conceive. The translation virgin is from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which is Parthenos. You know that you've heard of the Parthenon in Athens? That's named after that, because didn't they have the Vestal virgins or something there? Anyway, it uses that term virgin. But the Hebrew term alma can refer to a young woman of marriageable age, whether she's married or not. So some people say, it's not really necessarily a virgin at all, a young woman. Well, you see, it's supposed to be a miraculous sign to King Ahaz in that context. If it's a young woman who's married, how would that be a miraculous sign if she has a child? Okay? All right. If it's going to be a miraculous sign, she needs to be unmarried. However, if she's unmarried, she would be a naughty girl, right? And then she'd be stoned to death. That's not going to work out. So we have a really unusual situation going on here. And the biggest argument for her being a virgin, because Hebrew has no one word that always means a technical virgin. Even the word Batulah, which is usually translated virgin, doesn't necessarily mean that. But we know that because in Genesis, I think it's 26, the story of Rebekah. So she was a Batulah. She had never known a man. See? It wouldn't have to say that if it just automatically meant that she had never known a man. And other places as well. So just by context, it ultimately needs to be, if it's going to be a miracle, it needs to be an unmarried woman. And it needs to be an unmarried virgin, because if she were an unmarried, say, premarital sex woman, I don't know how you say that, promiscuous woman, then that wouldn't be very good for God to have a sign, would it? Does that help a little? Yeah. Right. Well, if he's going to be named Emmanuel, God with us, as a sign, it really needs to come from a virtuous relationship, doesn't it? Because Isaiah, his children, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz and Ar-Yeshuv and these others, their names meant something, and they were the result of the marriage of Isaiah and his wife, who was called a prophetess, Neviah. Okay, we have some reference to that. All right, well, let's end there. Okay? I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. Oh, but you have one more. Yes. Okay. If the Jewish people, I'm repeating the question for everyone, if the Jewish people don't believe the Messiah has come, why don't they still do the sacrifices? Okay. Now, you know, at Passover and other times, particularly Passover, they leave an empty chair. It's called the Elijah chair, allowing the possibility for Elijah to show up, the forerunner of the Messiah. They get that from Malachi that we read. So there is definitely a messianic hope that's in Judaism. They don't believe that he's come. Orthodox Jews, and you can find this information online, as I did the other day, confirmation of it. Orthodox Jews believe that the sacrifices should still be practiced, and the only thing that's keeping them from being practiced is because there's not a third temple. And the only reason why there's a third temple is because there's another structure in that same spot, which could not be removed without World War III. Okay? That's the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, right on the Temple Mount. So that's the only thing in the way. Now, there are some evangelical Christians who would like to help the Jewish people by helping to get rid of that Dome of the Rock. That's why there's such tight security there. And in fact, there was one minister from Australia, from some denomination years ago, who firebombed the El Aqsa Mosque that's right close by there, trying to get rid of it. So this is really serious. Now, we know that the Orthodox Jews are serious about this. They really believe that there's going to be a third temple that the Messiah is going to institute, or that will be instituted to prepare for the Messiah. You can go in Jerusalem. Did you go to the little museum in Jerusalem where there's they've built already some of the tabernacle furniture, the temple furniture for the third temple? I've seen it, the menorah. You seen that in Jerusalem? Uh-huh. Online? Temple Institute. Yes. Yes. They're prepared. They're practicing doing the rituals. But they need two things. They need a red heifer, so they're looking for a reddish heifer. Otherwise, everyone's impure. And they need also an oracle from God, the Urim and Thummim, or something like that, to tell them who the true line of the high priest is, because the high priestly line, the last high priest, was tossed over the temple wall in 70 AD by the Zealots. See? So they're just waiting for some things to fall into place, and then they want to go on doing the sacrifices. Does that help answer your question? Now, Reformed Jews and other Jews are willing to live with the fact that that era is over, okay, and that prayer has replaced sacrifice, and that doesn't necessarily have to be done. But there are those who still are hardcore believers in that. And evangelical Christians, in some cases, particularly futurist dispensationalists, who believe there's going to be a third temple and 144,000 converted Jews are going to go out and convert the world. They take things very, very literally. Those people are supporting Israel, and in fact, they have a lot of influence in U.S. foreign policy. Not so much in the present administration, but in the previous one, a lot. And you can watch things going on in the way the U.S. reacts to what's going on in the Middle East, and you can see behind that certain theological convictions of that kind of an approach. The U.S. is not going to allow Israel to fall, because there is too many people who believe that there has to be a third temple there for Christ to come, and for the rapture which they believe in to take place. Now, we don't believe in the rapture in that way. We take that more figuratively when Jesus says that about that, so we don't make a big eschatological event out of it, but a lot of people do. And that all has political consequences in our world, which generates a reality of its own. Very interesting. And if I were ever in Israel, as I will be next summer, and somebody blows up the Dome of the Rock, I'm going to jump in the Mediterranean and start swimming, because that will be instant World War III. It can happen any time. You know, if something like that happens, there will be a massive jihad. It would unite the opposition like nothing else, and it'd be serious. Yeah. Okay.
Years ago, and I can't tell you what year, but years ago, Biblical Archaeology Review published an article showing that the Dome of the Rock does not in any way interfere with the ability today to build that third temple.
Uh-huh.
Because the idea that the Dome of the Rock was in the way is based on the location of the Eastern Gate.
Right.
But there was, back in whenever it was, there was a group of yeshiva students who bribed an Arab guard to let them go into the cemetery that's outside the Eastern Gate. Because they weren't allowed to be in there. So they bribed the Arab guard to let them in. Well, it had been raining, and the guy climbed up on a tombstone, and the grave collapsed. And, of course, created quite an incident until they got him out. But
Oh, I never heard about this.
He had
Wow.
a camera with him.
Mhm.
There was no light down in there, but he fell in a mass grave.
Mm.
And there was no light in there, but he had this camera. So he started clicking pictures
Mm.
the entire 360 degrees around that area.
Uh-huh.
And what those pictures revealed was the Eastern Gate.
Ah.
Eastern Gate.
Ah.
And it is not in the place where the current
The current is closed up. The Golden Gate is, and I used to walk by it every day to go to school at the Hebrew University, and it's closed up waiting for the Messiah to come. And there's a lot of politics going on there. But you see, there are, what she's talking about is that there is one scholarly theory or view that, in fact, the Dome of the Rock is not where the temple was, and the third temple could be built on the Temple Mount. The trouble is that the whole Temple Mount area is controlled by the Muslims. And so that would still be an obstacle, although, you know, that could be maybe worked out without removing the present structure. And however, there's others like Ann Rittmeyer, who has found an indentation in the rock that's under the Dome of the Rock, which is where Abraham was supposed to have sacrificed Isaac. And there's an indentation in that rock which is the same dimensions as the Ark of the Covenant, which looks like, and his theory is, that the Ark of the Covenant was actually placed there. And according to the Mishnah, on the Day of Atonement, this high priest used to sprinkle the blood, because in the second temple, the Ark was gone. Babylonians, was hid by Jeremiah. It was gone, and he used to sprinkle there towards where the Ark of the Covenant had been, on a rock. And so there's different, there's debate about this. Biblical Archaeology Review had this article. I need to look again at that. That's really interesting. And I'll ask Randy Yonker, who works with my wife in the Archaeology Institute, about that. Thank you so much. Okay, good. You had a comment as well? You forgot the comment? Okay. All right. That's probably a signal that we need to quit. Wow, we've really been going for a while. The Torah is rich stuff. Let's have a prayer, shall we? Father in heaven, thank you so much for your mercy, and that you make things plain and sensible to us, that you make your obedience accessible to us. We want to follow you. Please give us the willpower, the strength to choose, to make the right choices, to accept your gift. And please take us, lead us to the ultimate promised land. Help us all to get there. As we sometimes struggle along, we sometimes fall. Help us up, and may we help each other up. We thank you for this massive, wonderful support system that we have, and we're grateful for all of your mercy, your love. In your name, amen. Okay, God bless. It's been wonderful to chat with you. This is one of my favorite things, is question and answer. I love to dialogue with people. Okay. Oh, by the way, I think, he wants to make a brief announcement.
I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming out. Who here learned something today? I know I did. I learned a lot. So I'd like to thank you here. Out in the foyer, we have these two books, or a book and a DVD, rather. Altar Call by Roy Gane, where you can learn more. Like, he can't cover everything he can while he's here. So this is a book on the sanctuary, and it also, at the end, kind of ties it into how the book of Daniel uses the sanctuary message. And this is kind of the companion DVD. So they're out on a table outside. You can help yourself. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks. You want to tell them the price?
Oh, one more thing. The price of these, you might need to know that. The book is $10 and the DVD is $15.
The DVD is $5.
$5? Oh, $5. Okay, cheaper. All right. I guess I misheard you.
It was 15, but I bought out the guy that produced it, so I had all the stuff.